When Rob Reiner sits down to talk about his father, Carl Reiner, there is always a pause, a quiet moment where memory takes over. It's in that space between words where laughter, loss, and legacy all collide. In a new documentary exploring the extraordinary friendship between Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks, Rob Reiner opens a deeply personal window into one of comedy's most enduring partnerships, a bond that shaped American humor for more than 7 decades. This is not just a story about two legendary comedians. It's a story about loyalty, creative survival, shared roots, and the rare magic that happens when two people grow old together without ever growing apart. A friendship born before fame. Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks met long before their names became comedy royalty. Both were young, ambitious, and hungry to make people laugh in post-war America. They shared similar backgrounds: Jewish families, sharp wit, and an instinctive understanding of humor rooted in both pain and joy. According to Rob Reiner, the early years were defined by struggle as much as laughter. They weren't legends yet. Rob recalls in the documentary, they were just two guys trying to get work, trying to figure out who they were, and leaning on each other to survive. Their friendship deepened during their time working on Your Show of Shows, the groundbreaking television variety program that became a breeding ground for comedic brilliance. While the world saw sketches, jokes, and slapstick, behind the scenes, Carl and Mel were building something far more lasting, a creative trust that would withstand fame, ego, and time. The 2,000-year-old man, a comic miracle. One of the most iconic outcomes of their friendship was the 2,000-year-old man, a comedy routine that seemed deceptively simple but was revolutionary in execution. Carl played the interviewer. Mel improvised as a man who had lived for 2 millennia. The result was spontaneous, intelligent, and timeless. Rob Reiner describes watching his father and Mel Brooks perform together as witnessing a kind of telepathy. They didn't rehearse the way people think, he explains. They listened. They reacted. They trusted each other completely. The documentary reveals that the success of the 2,000-year-old man wasn't just about comedic talent. It was about emotional safety. Carl gave Mel the space to be wild and absurd, while Mel pushed Carl into unexpected territory. Neither tried to dominate the other. That balance became the secret sauce. Friendship over competition. In an industry notorious for rivalry, jealousy, and broken relationships, Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks were an anomaly. They celebrated each other's successes without resentment. When Mel went on to direct iconic films like Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, Carl cheered from the sidelines. When Carl created The Dick Van Dyke Show, Mel was among his loudest supporters. Rob Reiner reflects on how rare that dynamic was and still is. They never saw each other as competition, he says. They saw each other as partners in joy. The documentary underscores this point through archival footage, letters, and audio recordings that reveal warmth rather than rivalry. Even when their careers diverged, the friendship never wavered. Laughter is survival. One of the most powerful themes in the documentary is how humor functioned as a survival tool. Both Carl and Mel lived through historical trauma, war, anti-Semitism, cultural upheaval, and comedy became a way to process the world. Rob Reiner explains that laughter wasn't just entertainment in their lives, it was protection. They used humor to push back against darkness, he says. That's why their comedy lasted. It came from something real. Mel Brooks, now in his late 90s, appears in the documentary with the same sharp sparkle in his eyes. He speaks of Carl not just as a collaborator, but as a brother. Carl knew when to pull me back and when to let me go, Mel says. That's love. Watching a father, learning a legacy. For Rob Reiner, the documentary is as much about personal inheritance as it is about public history. Growing up, he didn't just see Carl Reiner as a father. He saw him as a craftsman, a professional friend, someone who showed up for others. I learned how to be a collaborator by watching my dad with Mel, Rob admits. I learned that success means nothing if you don't share it. Rob's own career as an actor, director, and storyteller was deeply shaped by those lessons. Films like When Harry Met Sally, Stand By Me, and The Princess Bride carry the same spirit of human connection that defined Carl and Mel's work. The documentary subtly draws that line, showing how one generation's friendship can ripple into the next. Aging, loss, and the end of an era. Carl Reiner passed away in 2020 at the age of 98. His death marked the end of an era, not just for Rob Reiner, but for American comedy itself. In the documentary, Rob speaks openly about the grief, quiet, enduring, and complicated. What hurt the most, Rob says softly, was knowing Mel lost his best friend. The film doesn't shy away from that reality. It shows Mel Brooks reflecting on life without Carl, acknowledging the silence where laughter once lived. Yet even in loss, humor persists. Mel jokes. Rob smiles through tears. The legacy continues. Why this friendship still matters. In a fast-paced, digital world where collaboration is often transactional and friendships are fleeting, the story of Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks feels almost radical. Two men who stood by each other for over 70 years. Two artists who chose generosity over ego. Two friends who prove that laughter is stronger when shared. Rob Reiner hopes audiences take something simple from the documentary. It's not just about comedy, he says. It's about showing up for someone for decades. The film ultimately becomes a meditation on time, how it shapes us, tests us, and if we're lucky, allows us to walk alongside someone who understands us completely. A final laugh, forever echoing. As the documentary closes, viewers are left not with sadness, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the jokes that still make us laugh. Gratitude for the friendship that showed us what creative partnership can look like at its best. Rob Reiner doesn't frame his father as a myth. He frames him as a man who loved deeply, laughed loudly, and chose friendship every single day. And in doing so, Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks didn't just change comedy. They gave the world a masterclass in how to live, how to create, and how to remain human in the spotlight. Their laughter may have begun decades ago, but its echo is timeless. The echo of their laughter, Rob Reiner suggests, didn't disappear with his father's passing. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something more reflective. In the film's later moments, Rob speaks about how Mel Brooks still talks about Carl in the present tense. Not as someone who was, but as someone who is. Someone whose voice still pops up in Mel's mind when he's writing, joking, or even sitting alone. That's the thing about a friendship that lasts that long, Rob says. It doesn't end. It just changes shape. Conversations that never really end. One especially poignant segment of the documentary focuses on Mel Brooks recording voice memos after Carl's death. Short, spontaneous thoughts meant for no one in particular. In one, Mel chuckles and says, "Carl would have loved this joke." In another, there's silence before Mel quietly adds, "You had told me to cut that line." Rob Reiner admits these moments were difficult to watch at first. It felt too private, he says. But then I realized, this is the continuation of their friendship, even now. The documentary makes it clear that Carl Reiner wasn't just Mel's creative partner. He was his moral compass. When Mel pushed boundaries, Carl grounded him. When Carl hesitated, Mel urged him forward. That push and pull didn't vanish with time. It simply became memory. Humor as a bridge across generations. As the film unfolds, it also turns toward younger comedians and filmmakers who reflect on Carl and Mel's influence. Many admit they never met Carl Reiner personally, yet feel they know him through his work and through Mel Brooks' stories. Rob Reiner finds comfort in that. "My dad believed comedy should connect generations," he says. And now, decades later, people who weren't even born when he started are still laughing. The documentary draws a quiet but powerful parallel. Just as Carl and Mel once learned from their elders, today's creators are learning from them. Their friendship becomes a blueprint, not only for comedy, but for creative longevity. The rare gift of being understood. Perhaps the most emotionally resonant expansion of the story comes when Rob reflects on what his father gained from Mel that no award or accolade could provide: understanding. "My dad was a thoughtful guy," Rob explains. "He could be serious, introspective. Mel brought out his childlike joy. And my dad gave Mel permission to be vulnerable, even when he hid it behind jokes." That mutual understanding, the documentary argues, is what allowed their friendship to endure marriages, careers, failures, successes, and aging. They didn't demand each other stay the same. They grew together. Legacy beyond the spotlight. In the final expanded moments, the film shifts away from stages, studios, and spotlights focusing instead on kitchens, living rooms, and phone calls. Rob Reiner recalls late-night conversations where Carl and Mel talked not about comedy, but about family, fear, and getting older. They weren't trying to be funny all the time, Rob says. They were just honest. That honesty, the documentary suggests, is the truest legacy of the friendship. Not the punchlines, not the accolades, but the ability to sit with another person for a lifetime and still find joy in simply being heard. A friendship that outlives time. As the story expands, one truth becomes unavoidable. Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks didn't just share a career, they shared a life philosophy. Laugh when things hurt, stay curious, be kind, and never let success cost you your humanity. Rob Reiner closes this extended reflection with a simple observation that feels heavier than any tribute. My dad used to say that if you're lucky, you get one great friend in life. He was luckier than most. The documentary doesn't try to replace Carl Reiner or preserve him in amber. Instead, it lets him live on through stories, laughter, and the unbroken bond he formed with Mel Brooks, a bond that continues to inspire long after the curtain has fallen. And in that sense, the friendship never truly ended. It just became part of the laughter we all still share, continuing from that quiet realization that the friendship never truly ended. The documentary lingers a little longer in that emotional space, allowing the audience to sit with what it means to carry someone after they're gone. Rob Reiner explains that after Carl's death, there was an unexpected shift in how he himself remembered his father. When someone passes, Rob reflects, you think the memories will freeze. But they don't. They keep evolving. In conversations with Mel Brooks, Rob found himself learning new stories about Carl, stories from decades earlier, moments Rob had never witnessed. In that way, Mel became not just a grieving friend, but a living archive of Carl Reiner's life. Memory as collaboration. The film subtly suggests that even in absence, Carl and Mel were still collaborating, this time through memory. Mel would recall a joke, and Rob would remember a lesson. One memory would spark another, like an improvised routine that never truly ends. There were things Mel remembered about my dad that even I didn't know, Rob admits. And there were things I could tell Mel that helped him see Carl as a father, not just a partner. That exchange becomes one of the documentary's most intimate themes. Grief shared is grief softened. Rather than framing loss as an ending, the film treats it as a continuation, another chapter in a lifelong dialogue. The weight of silence. One particularly moving segment focuses on silence. Rob notes that for decades, Carl and Mel spoke almost daily. When that rhythm stopped, it left a void that words couldn't fill. For Mel, Rob says, the hardest part wasn't missing the jokes. It was missing the listener. That observation reframes the entire friendship. Yes, Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks were comedic giants, but what made their bond extraordinary was not how loudly they laughed, but how attentively they listened. The documentary returns to this idea again and again, that being truly heard is one of the rarest gifts in any life. Lessons left behind. As the story expands, the film also explores what Carl Reiner intentionally passed on, values he believed mattered more than fame. Rob recalls his father emphasizing professionalism, kindness, and gratitude. My dad always said, talent gets you noticed. Character keeps you working. Mel Brooks echoes that sentiment in one of his quieter moments on screen. Carl never punched down, Mel says. He didn't need to. He was confident enough to lift people up. That ethic, the documentary suggests, is why their work still resonates. It wasn't built on cruelty or cynicism, but on shared humanity. Time, gently closing the circle. As Mel Brooks reflects on reaching the later years of his own life, he speaks candidly about time, how it speeds up, how it softens regrets, how it sharpens gratitude. He doesn't speak with fear, but with a sense of completion. I got to do it all, Mel says, and I got to do it with Carl. For Rob Reiner, hearing that is both comforting and bittersweet. It confirms that his father lived a full life, rich not only in success, but in companionship. That's the part I hold on to, Rob says. Not the fame, the friendship. What remains? The documentary doesn't end with applause or montage-heavy nostalgia. Instead, it closes with something simpler. Laughter fading into conversation, conversation fading into quiet. The message is subtle but clear. True friendship doesn't demand permanence to be meaningful. Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks built something that outlived schedules, studios, and even mortality. Their bond became a living example of how creativity thrives when rooted in trust, and how humor becomes timeless when grounded in love. And as Rob Reiner gently reminds the audience, that may be the greatest legacy of all, not the jokes we remember, but the way two friends chose each other again and again for a lifetime. The laughter still echoes, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily, like a voice you recognize immediately, even when it comes from memory. From that steady echo of remembered laughter, the documentary takes one final, deeper breath, slowing down even more, as if reluctant to let the story rest. Rob Reiner describes a moment that didn't make headlines, didn't involve cameras, and wasn't meant for history books. It was a quiet afternoon when Mel Brooks came over after Carl's passing. They sat together, not talking much at first. No jokes, no punchlines. Just two people bound by one man they both loved in different ways. At one point, Rob recalls, Mel just said, "Your father knew me better than anyone." And then he smiled. That smile said everything. When laughter becomes language, the documentary gently suggests that for Carl and Mel, comedy was never just performance. It was a language they built together. Over decades, they developed a shared rhythm so precise that even silence carried meaning. A raised eyebrow, a pause, a single word spoken differently than expected. That was enough. Rob explains that watching them was like watching jazz. They weren't reading sheet music, he says. They were listening to each other. That ability to truly listen becomes the emotional backbone of the film's final expansion. In a world that rewards quick responses and louder voices, Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks practiced patience. They let moments breathe. They trusted that something better would emerge if they didn't rush it. The human side of legends. As the story widens further, the documentary intentionally strips away the mythology. It shows Carl Reiner as someone who worried about relevance, who questioned whether his best work was behind him. It shows Mel Brooks as someone who feared loneliness more than obscurity. Rob Reiner admits that seeing his father wrestle with doubt was confusing as a child. You assume legends are immune to fear, he says. They're not. They just learn how to live alongside it. What made Carl and Mel extraordinary wasn't that they avoided fear. It was that they shared it. Their friendship became a place where vulnerability was allowed, even protected. And in that space, creativity flourished. A model for the future. One of the documentary's quiet achievements is how it reframes success. It doesn't measure Carl and Mel's legacy by box office numbers or awards, but by endurance, emotional, creative, and human. Rob Reiner points out that many brilliant partnerships burn out quickly. What they had was sustainable, he says, because it wasn't built on ego. That idea resonates strongly in the film's final passages, almost like a message passed forward. The friendship becomes a guidepost for future artists. Choose collaborators who care about you as a person, not just your output. Choose people who will tell you the truth and still stay. The lasting presence of absence. As the documentary nears its end, Mel Brooks reflects on absence, not as emptiness, but as presence transformed. "Carl's still with me," Mel says matter-of-factly. "I just don't get to argue with him anymore." Rob smiles at that line, recognizing its truth. His father's influence didn't stop when his voice did. It shows up in Rob's decisions, his patience, the way he treats people on set. "You don't stop being someone's son," Rob says, "even when they're gone." The film allows that thought to linger, trusting the audience to feel its weight. An ending without an end. Rather than closing with a definitive conclusion, the story fades out the way their friendship unfolded, naturally, without force. There is no attempt to summarize decades into a single lesson. Instead, the documentary leaves viewers with an understanding. Some relationships don't need endings to be complete. Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks gave the world laughter, yes, but more importantly, they demonstrated how a life shared can become a life well lived. And as Rob Reiner's reflections settle into silence, one final idea remains, that somewhere between humor and honesty, between collaboration and friendship, two men found a way to walk through time together. Not chasing immortality, not trying to be remembered, just choosing every day to keep talking and listening to each other. From that quiet understanding that some relationships don't need endings to feel whole, the documentary eases into its final emotional stretch, as if gently circling the truth one last time before letting it go. Rob Reiner reflects on how, in the months after Carl's passing, he began to notice small habits that suddenly carried new meaning. A turn of phrase, a pause before responding, even the way he laughed. I realized, Rob says, I was carrying pieces of my dad without even trying. And often, those same pieces appeared in Mel Brooks, too mirrored, familiar, comforting. When friendship becomes identity, the film suggests something subtle but profound. After decades of shared life, Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks didn't just influence each other, they became part of each other's identity. Their humor overlapped, their instincts aligned, their values merged. Mel admits that there are moments when he still thinks I should call Carl. Not out of habit, but out of instinct. He was my first audience, Mel says. If Carl laughed, I knew I was okay. Rob pauses when he hears that. He recognizes the weight of it. To be someone's first audience, to be trusted with the raw, unfinished version of an idea, is an intimacy few friendships ever reach. The courage to grow old together. Another layer unfolds as the documentary reflects on aging not as decline, but as courage. Growing older in public can be isolating, especially in entertainment. Trends move on, attention fades, but Carl and Mel grew old together, side by side, joking about age rather than hiding from it. They didn't pretend time wasn't passing, Rob says. They embraced it. They made it funny. In doing so, they gave permission to others to age honestly, with humor instead of shame. The documentary frames this not as a coincidence, but as a choice, one rooted in their friendship. Facing time together made it less frightening. The space they created for others. As the story expands, the film highlights how Carl and Mel didn't just nurture each other. They nurtured everyone around them. Writers, performers, assistants, even strangers who crossed their path were often drawn into their orbit. Rob remembers his father insisting that younger voices be heard. He believed comedy was a relay race, Rob explains. You carry it for a while, then you pass it on. Mel Brooks echoes that idea in his own way. Carl wanted people to win, he says simply. That's rare. That generosity becomes one of the documentary's quiet revelations. Their friendship wasn't a closed circle. It was a foundation strong enough to support others. Love, disguised as humor. As the film stretches toward its final moments, it gently reframes everything that came before. The jokes, the routines, the legendary performances, all of it the documentary suggests was love disguised as humor. Neither Carl Reiner nor Mel Brooks were sentimental men in the traditional sense. They didn't make grand declarations. They teased. They'd argued. They interrupted each other. But beneath that was devotion, steady, unquestioned, enduring. Rob Reiner says it best, almost as an afterthought. My dad showed love by showing up, again and again. What the story leaves us with, the documentary doesn't ask viewers to mourn Carl Reiner. It asks them to notice the people in their own lives. The collaborators, the friends, the ones who listen when no one else does. Because in the end, the story of Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks isn't just about comedy history. It's about the rare privilege of being fully known by another person and choosing to stay decade after decade. As the screen fades to black, there's no final joke, no dramatic farewell, just the sense that somewhere in memory and influence, two old friends are still talking, still listening, still making each other better. And perhaps that's the most lasting laugh of all.